Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Woodstock Historical Society's second Ghost Walk. We are here at Lakeside Cemetery. It is August 28th, 2021, and we have four presenters today. They will help explain to you what life might have been like for some of our ancestors back here in the earlier days of Bryant Pond and the town of Woodstock. Our first presenter is Mr. Alfred Chase.
Hello and welcome. My name is Alfred Chase. I was one of the original founders of the Universalist Church of Woodstock. There were 14 founders. Most but not all are buried here at the Lakeside Cemetery. Building began in the spring of 1852. The site was chosen because the Grand Trunk Railway had decided to bring the railroad track through the town. It was the first church erected in town. The church began 10 years earlier when D.T. Stevens held a 3-day meeting. At this meeting, he baptized 13 people. The Universalist foundation stones are belief in God as having a loving and parental nature, and the importance of reason and human nature in understanding the Bible. My family has been in Woodstock since the town was incorporated. I heard from my elders how Edmund Chase settled in Newbury, Massachusetts, married Esther Merrill in 1769, and moved to Minot. My elders also explained to me how my father, Merrill, came to Woodstock with his older brother, Stephen. Stephen Chase had many firsts in Woodstock. Uncle Stephen was a hard act to follow. My father married Sally Tucker first, and I was their third child. I was born in 1801. I married Elvira Perham in 1831. My father built the first mill in that part of town known as Sygotch, which is in the north part of Woodstock to the west of the Billings district. The Universalist Church met in the Chase House and the social schoolhouse. I was elected a steward at the first meeting. In 1843, a social library was organized by virtue of a warrant issued to Alden Chase, my half-brother. I was chosen to be librarian. Our Constitution provided for an annual meeting at the dwelling house of the librarian on the first Saturday of December. 50 cents were required to join, with an annual assessment of 10 cents. People from surrounding towns also joined our library. Books were allowed to be kept 12 weeks, and only one volume could be taken out at a time. Our collection of books were mostly sectarian and included Ancient and Modern History of Universalism, Happy Death Scenes, and The Law of Kindness. The library was moved to the Universalist Church in 1858 when I stepped down. Joel Perham, my wife's uncle, served as librarian for 2 years, then Elvira's sister Delphina Whitman. When the library disbanded in 1868, the books were dispersed to the members. I died July 24th, 1874, and am buried here at Lakeside Cemetery. Thank you for attending the Woodstock Historical Society Ghost Walk. Please join us after in the basement of the church for some refreshments. Thank you.
Imagine yourself in a place and time more than 300 miles and 100 years away. You're seated in an enormous auditorium. A vast sea of people extends all around you. It's 1915, and you're at the 1st Regiment Armory in Newark, New Jersey, on the opening night of the first annual Newark Music Festival. Some of the biggest operatic stars in the world are soon to perform. Pasquale Amato, Anna Case, Paul Althaus. There's a 100-piece orchestra, and a chorus of 1,200 voices stands at the ready. You can hear the sounds of the trumpet beginning to warm up, and there's a constant hum of conversation as the audience, which has come not just from Newark, but from all of the surrounding communities as well, chatters excitedly. But there's a momentary hush as the conductor takes the podium, and an enthusiastic round of applause is given to the musical director of the Newark Festival, the man who has made all of this happen. That's me, Charles Mortimer Weisky, but you can call me Mort. Yes, I lived an amazing life. I was born in Bennington, Vermont on January 26, 1853, the son of Charles Henry Weisky and Louisa M. Boynton. When I was young, my family moved to Troy, New York, where my father ran a parasol shop on Congress Street. My musical talent began to show itself at an early age, and by the time I was 9, I was playing the organ for a local chapel. By my early 20s, I was working as a pianist. I played a concert for the opening of a new town hall in Waterford, New York, and on many other places on many other occasions. I moved to Brooklyn, where on April 8, 1875, I married the beautiful young singer Emma Elizabeth DeMott, who descended from an old Long Island family. Together we would have 2 children, May Louise Weisky, born in 1878, and Prescott Barker Weisky, born November 21, 1887. In the 1880s, I served as chorus master of Theodore Thomas's New York Chorus Society. I also served as director of the Amphion Musical Society of Brooklyn from its incorporation in 1882. Throughout my years in Brooklyn, I directed numerous societies and played piano or organ on many notable occasions. In 1885, the Amphion Musical Society performed at a musical service for Ulysses S. Grant, held at the Academy of Music in Brooklyn. On March 8, 1887, a memorial service was held for General John A. Logan. The Amphion Society Chorus performed special music, which I wrote for the occasion, and on that day, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher was to have given the opening prayer, but alas, he fell ill a few days earlier and had succumbed that very same day. It wasn't all clear blue skies for me. In February of 1891, I was subjected to one of the most caustic and loathsome reviews I have ever received. Some critic from the New York Times wrote that I, quote, must be possessed of a windbag in place of a brain, that I could stand up and conduct such rot. Well, can you believe that? That same year, a conflict developed between me and the Amphion Musical Society that resulted in my separation from that society. It all started at a concert of the Cecilia Ladies Vocal Society, which I had organized 5 years prior and directed since the beginning. A few of the ladies were talking when they should not have been, and so I said to them, "Be quiet! You are not here to talk, but to sing." Now, I will admit that I said this rather loudly so that the whole audience could hear it. Well, the ladies didn't like that very much. Shortly thereafter, when I came up for re-election as director, they decided to vote me out and replace me with this man Neidlinger. Well then, the next thing I know, the board of directors of the Amphion Musical Society voted to reduce my pay. Now, they claimed this had nothing to do with the rebuke by the Cecilia ladies, and was only because of the declining fortunes of the society, which had faced competition in recent years after the formation of the Hanover Club. There is no dissatisfaction with Mr. Weisky, they claimed. But it's well known that the ladies of the Cecilia Society were nearly all relatives of the members of the Amphion Society, and there was sure to have been considerable pressure put on the husbands by their wives. In general, however, my performances received rave reviews, and my fame and reputation was growing steadily. In 1896, I moved to Paterson, New Jersey, where I directed the Orpheus Club, which had been formed a few years prior. In 1899, I played the funeral marches of Chopin, and the Orpheus Club performed at the funeral for Vice President Garrett A. Hobart, who died while in office. I also became the musical director for many years of the Paterson Music Festival and served the local churches. In September of 1902, my wife Emma and I bought land on the south shore of Lake Christopher, here in Woodstock, where we built a summer home, Birch Villa. My beloved wife Emma passed away on Christmas Day of 1907, at the age of 48, after 32 years of marriage. The next year, I married Frances, or Fanny, Stanley, a singer and pianist who I had worked with, and we remained together for the next 26 years until my own death. I was nearing my 60s by this point, but that didn't slow me down. The 19-teens were the peak of my career. I directed not only the Paterson Music Festival, but also the Newark Music Festival beginning in 1915, and in 1916 another big festival in Jersey City, though I had so much work by this time I was only able to commit to the latter for 1 year. The Newark Festival was a roaring success, but of course you can't please everybody. It seems one Samuel Wilson, editor of the American Issue, the official organ of the Anti-Saloon League, took exception to the inclusion of a drinking song from Faust the famous opera by Gounod, in the festival. He wrote up an article about me headlined, "Whiskey's Chorus to Sing Whiskey's Praises," and called for a boycott of the festival. Can you believe that? Well, the members of my chorus, many of whom were recruited from the choirs of leading Patterson churches, and several hundred of whom had even volunteered their services for the Billy Sunday Revival campaign, found the whole affair pretty ridiculous. As one of them told that reporter from the Newark Evening Star, "I have not seen the article alluded to, but from what I have heard, it is the most asinine thing I have ever listened to. It is too bad that some of the modern reformers that we have in the country are not fighting at the front in Europe. They surely would not be missed, and they might get what was coming to them." As for me, I resigned from the Anti-Saloon League of New Jersey, and I know of at least one prominent Newark clergyman who did the same. Probably the largest event I ever took part in was an enormous war thrift festival at the New York Polo Grounds in 1918, where a production of Elijah was held with a 10,000-member chorus. Lieutenant John Philip Sousa accompanied with a 200-person band, and I was one of more than half a dozen conductors who trained the chorus. In 1921, Fanny and I hired contractor Maurice Noyes of South Paris to do some work for us to expand Birch Villa. And on June 1st of that year, Birch Villa Camp, later incorporated as the Birch Villa Inn, was opened as a summer resort under the management of my wife Fanny. Many famous people came to stay at Birch Villa over the years, especially big stars from the world of music. Fanny continued to run the resort even after my death, finally selling it in 1950. On Friday, July 6, 1934, I was staying here at our summer home when I suffered a fall and broke my hip. They rushed me to the Central Maine Hospital in Lewiston, but being 81 years old at the time, I was unable to recover and died in the early hours of Monday, July 9th. 2 days later, they held my funeral services here at the Universalist Church, and they placed me in my final resting place.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rufus K. Dunham. I was born in Parkman, Maine, which is up north of Bangor, in 1824. As a young lad, I caught a bad fever that went down into my leg, and it lamed me for life. So if you see me limping around, that's the reason for that. When I was 12 years old, actually I should mention who my parents were. My parents were Ransom and Susan Jackson Dunham. And in when I was 12 years old, we moved to Woodstock. And we moved out to North Woodstock, which is also called Pinhook. And it seems like my father was a blacksmith for 6 days a week, and he was also a minister on Sundays. So let me check my hearing. Okay. Now, when I grew up there, we went to school in Pinhook. There is a story, and I'm not going to say whether it was really true or not, but it says that I was kind of infatuated by my teacher's brass buttons that he had on his coat. My teacher was Sidney Parham, by the way, who became governor of Maine afterwards. And so the story goes, says that with my sharp knife, one day one of those buttons was missing, and that I took it home as a souvenir, and, well, it might be true. Okay. Now, I worked with my father as I was growing up, and one day we were shingling our house out there in Pinhook, and my father had gone to get some equipment or whatever, and he was coming back on his path, and he was being followed by what I thought was a black dog. And as we get closer, that black dog looked a lot more like a black bear. And I kind of yelled to my father that he probably wanted to hurry up a little bit. And so he did. He hurried up to the house where we were working, grabbed an axe, and then we turned around and chased that bear through the swamp, over some of the fields, the forest. But boy, that bear was really fast, and he did escape. Besides working with my father, I worked in a store. I worked in Paris Hill. I worked in Trap Corner, and also at one of the stores right there in North Woodstock or Pinhook. And I got married. I married Abby Estes. We had 4 children: Emma, Eva, May, and Charles. Now, I was kind of interested in business and getting into business of my own. And about this time, I heard that a railroad was being built through the town of Woodstock. And knowing that they would probably be needing a lot of wood and other materials, I knew of this land that abutted our property. And it was a very wild land, had a lot of trees in it. And the owner of it actually lived in New Hampshire. So I sent an agent to New Hampshire who negotiated and actually bought that land for me. And so when I actually became formal owner of that land, I actually was able to sell 1 mile of cedar ties to the railroad that was being built through town. So that gave me a little bit of a profit. Okay. In 1851, when the railroad had finally reached Bryant Pond, I was hired as station agent. And that was in like February. In March, the first train came through. And there was one incident when that train came through. Most people were happy about it. But there was an old bear hunter his name was Rouse Bisbee. And he just shook his head and he said, "There's be no bear hunting around for me anymore," with the unearthly yelling of that engine. But most people were pretty happy. The depot was kind of a strange affair because when the railroad was built, it had to be built, of course, to grade. And I'm sure that you know where the common is and the big telephone is there today. Well, that wasn't always flat. That actually was a big gully. And the station was built on tall wooden and granite pillars. So it stood up in the air. And my first job was to hire 2 yoke of oxen. And over the next 2 years, we took fill from the other side of what is now Route 26, around that corner, and we filled in that gully to make it what it is today. So you never know what you see is, what it used to be. Let's see. Well, besides being station agent, I was the express agent. I was the telegrapher for the telegraph. And for the first couple of years, I was also the post office manager. So, because after all, most of the mail did come up by train by that point. Okay, let's see. In 1856, of course, I was still living in Pinnock. In 1856, we actually sold our house in Pinnock, my father and I both, to Christopher Bryant Jr. And we moved to Bryant Pond Village. It was then being built. We lived just across the railroad tracks, just a little bit down there, on the road down to the public wharf. Okay. Now, when I was station agent, we did have a major event happen to the railroad. When the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railroad was built, it was built to what they call broad gauge, which is like 5 feet 6 inches wide. Well, most railroads around the country at that time were built to what they call standard gauge, which is 4 feet 8.5 inches. Well, it was discovered that changing cargo from like one line to another to ours was very difficult because you couldn't use our cars on their track and their cars on our track. You had to move all the freight by hand. So in September of 1874, during a one-day period, the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railroad changed its gauge by moving one rail from the 5 foot 6 inches to 4 foot 8.5 inches. Now the Bryant Pond area, we were responsible for 4.5 miles of track. And so when the last train went through that night, all the crews up and down the railroad got to work. And by 9 o'clock the next morning, Bryant Pond had finished theirs. And I telegraphed the main office, and they told us we were number one. We were first. So, the other thing I remember about rail line is that a siding was built to Mr. Dearborn's Mill, who just opened up on the hill here. That was in like 1880. In 1896, I finally retired after 45 years of being the one and only station agent here in Bryant Pond. My son Charles took over for the next 3 years, and then he moved down to South Paris, where the ice cream place is today, and he worked down there for over 20 years. After I retired, just a few days after that, I was rehired for one day to empty out 7 tons of coal, for which I got paid $1 for that day's work. I was 72 years old at that time. Then the next year in 97, I started to feel sick. And I had some serious illness. I had some kidney problems. And it bothered me all that summer. And the next year, in March 1898, I passed away. And this is where I reside today. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Glad you could be with us today. My name is Captain John Dearborn. I was born March 1836. Tell you a little bit about my family. My grandfather, Benjamin, was an inventor, and he invented the bar scales. He made quite a fortune of $100,000 back in the day. And when he got that money, he helped form the Boston Dispensary. I was born in Avon, Massachusetts, by the way. And my father was also an inventor, John, and he invented the furnace range, and he also invented the watering cart. He made several improvements to it, and that shows you that the family was quite inventive and mechanically inclined, which boded well for me in my future life. I was educated for the first 14 years in the Boston schools, and they were considered some of the best in the world. And then I went on to a business house where I traveled extensively. At the age of 20 years old, I decided I'd go with a group of men to Kansas City. And that was a tree state, we determined. We went there, but I couldn't find what I personally wanted in that tree state. So at the age of 21, I decided to be an able-bodied seaman. So I took to the sea. During that time, I went around the world at least twice, maybe 3 times. I really don't remember, but at least twice. I went to Manila for 6 months, and I was there. And then I went to Liverpool, England. And while in Liverpool, England, I found out that there was war in this country. I knew I had to come back and fight, because that's just what you did. You were an able-bodied man, and you had to come back and fight for your country. So I hopped the first ship back and got back here quick as a button. 2 months. That was quick. I got back here in 2 months. Well, the place to go was Washington. I went to Washington. Wouldn't you know it, President Abraham Lincoln and Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, had personal invites for me to come and meet with them. I went and met with them, and in 1861 I was presented as an acting master in the Navy. My first assignment was to the USS J.P. Jackson on the Western Blockade. That was down south, down towards New Orleans. I served under Admiral Farragut at the time, and I was present for the surrender of Fort Jackson in St. Philippe. I also was assistant at the New Orleans surrender. But I distinguished myself at Fort Gaines. Our men needed rations and supplies, so I took men up the river. And we went in and we got cattle and herded them back. Of course, we killed the cattle and we supplied the men with food that was badly needed to continue fighting for the Union cause. I also had a powder horn given to me by one of the men. They were so grateful for what I had done that he gave me a powder horn that I kept for many, many years. I also had a distinguished at Ship Island. The Confederates had decided to block the Mississippi River with metal hulks and chains. I took men and we went up the river under heavy Confederate fire. And I cleared that river with that, and we continued on to victory. I suffered heat stroke during that time because it was, wicked hot. Some wicked hot. And it just hurt me for several years thereafter. But being the people we are of sturdy stock, I continued on. After serving in the war, I was assigned to the Charleston Navy Shipyard as acting master, and I served there until 1866, and I served under Admiral Stringham. I left the Navy at that point in 1866 as a captain. I had to do something in civilian life, so I came back and I went to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I started a dowel mill. I was there for 3 years. After 3 years, I decided to move, and I decided to move up here to Lock Mills. I personally brought all the machinery from Portsmouth and went up to Lock. I installed that machinery in that mill, and I trained all the men on how to use that machinery in that mill. So many people from the surrounding towns came that I had to build houses for them. So we built mill houses for the men there. I taught them how to use that machinery. And we were going great guns for quite a while until 1879. The mill burned. Never did find out why, but it burned to the ground. And I knew I wanted to rebuild. And I started looking around, and I looked at Bryant Pond. The people of Bryant Pond held a meeting and said, if I brought my spool mill to Bryant Pond, they give me 10 years tax-free living. And that's great, great thing. And I brought my mill and I built it. Oh, I don't know where it is. It's not up here, but it was right up here. We built that mill and we started to do great business. In 1884, however, tragedy struck my mill again. We put in a boiler in the mill and we had 2 inspectors come up from Portland. That's quite a city, you know, down on the coast. They came up from Portland and they were inspecting the boiler and it blew up. Not only were those 2 men killed, but 2 of my own men in the mill were killed, and several were injured. I knew I wanted to rebuild because that was the right thing to do. So we rebuilt the mill. And you know, I paid everybody that helped me build that mill 30 cents on the dollar. We got it rebuilt. You know, the only good thing to do, once it was rebuilt and we were going great guns, I paid everybody that helped me rebuild that mill the other 70 cents on the dollar. Nobody lost a cent that helped me rebuild that mill. We were the biggest manufacturer of spools in the world, and we did it for Clark Thread and many other companies throughout the country and the world. Tell you a little bit about my life. When I was in Boston, I married Sarah Battelle. When I came to Bryant Pond, I fell in love with Nellie Brown. Unfortunately, Nellie Brown, who is here, died in childbirth with my child. This is who I am buried with. A little bit more about my personal life. I love books and I love music. And because of that, I decided to give the grove up here. Well, you can almost see it right up here, right up here. And it was a grove where they went and they had musicals and theater and had religious revival meetings. And they had Mason meetings, because I was a 32nd degree Mason, don't you know. We had a lot of good times in that grove. I died, as you can see on here, January 29th, 1906. And I was generous to a lot of the people in town. I gave them a lot. Organizations and people. But I guess the housekeeper who was with me after my wife died in childbirth, I left her my house. And that created some flapping of gums in town. The house I was in is the one up across from, well, your Historical Society today. That was quite a house. And I loved horses. That was another great favorite of mine, was the horses and the trotters I had. Best in the world, I thought, but probably not the best, but was in my eyes. So that kind of gives you an idea of what my life was all about here. And I was very civic-minded. I did everything I could for the town, because that's the way you did back in that day. Things have changed now, no more mill. I don't know what else to say other than here I am. Thank you.